Hey guys, it's your girl Cajun Sleep 08. I'm so used to saying that I forgot that I changed it. It is now just Cajun Sweet, aka La Cajun. And we're going to be reacting to one of Mr. Ballen's latest videos. And we're not gonna take too long. We're gonna get started right now and get right into it.
Today's story is about a murder from 2003 in Rochester, New York. Now, at first, when you listen to this story, it's going to sound like a sort of run of the mill murder case, if there is such a thing. But it's not. When you get to the end of the episode, we're going to reveal one piece of information that you didn't have, that not only will inform why anything happened in the story, it'll completely explain that, but more than that, it will totally alter your perspective of what you thought was happening when you first listened to the story. I'm sure a lot of you, once you reach the end, may consider listening to this story all over again. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So, if that's of interest to you, the next time the like button is having all their friends over for game night, secretly sneak into their house and replace all of their air fresheners with fart spray. Also,
Yeah.
please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story.
Too much blood.
On the morning of Sunday, July 13th, 2003, 26-year-old Tabitha Bryant walked through the front door of her big white house in Penfield, New York, which was an upper middle class suburb of Rochester. Her husband Kevin and their 2 young sons followed her inside, and they were all dressed in their Sunday best because they had just come back from church. However, on this morning, Tabitha sort of felt like a fraud because she knew she was not really living a Christian lifestyle. So Tabitha was actually having an affair with a guy named Keith. And her husband Kevin, who was 45 and nearly 20 years her senior, he had recently found out about it and confronted her about it. Tabitha, during this confrontation, had promised Kevin that she would end the affair. And then she and Kevin had agreed that they really needed to work on their marriage together. But
Hmm.
despite sort of coming to a kind of resolution, it was very obvious that Kevin was still very mad at her, and
And
so
that's
Tabitha had
justified.
been sleeping on the pull-out couch in the den ever since. Now, Tabitha watched as Kevin grabbed his briefcase off the kitchen counter, he kissed their 2 boys goodbye, and then he walked back out to his car. Tabitha was used to him disappearing to the office on the weekends. Kevin was a lawyer, and he worked basically all the time. And, they did depend on his salary, his big salary, to pay their mortgage and also finance their expensive lifestyle with vacations and lots of nights out. Now, despite Kevin's salary being so sizable, they had for a while tried to supplement his income by renting out a bedroom in their house to Tabitha's half brother, Cyril Weinbrenner, and his girlfriend, Cassidy Green. However, that arrangement, despite it being profitable for the couple, had ultimately soured when Cyril, the half brother, had begun using drugs inside of the house. And
Oh
so
no.
Cyril and Cassidy had moved out 2 months earlier, but despite, the terms on which they left, the group, Cyril, Cassidy, Tabitha, Kevin, their family, they remained friends and they would still actually spend time together on the weekends. It was just they were not able to live together. Now,
Mm.
Tabitha, she did like having that extra money coming in, but the truth was having her whole house back to herself was ultimately a good thing. Like she felt relieved in some ways. But also there was a part of her that sort of missed having, her half brother and Cassidy around, especially when Kevin was, gone all the time working. Like she just felt lonely. And also, on top of just being lonely, I mean, Tabitha often was the one saddled with childcare. They had a toddler and a 5 year old, and, she was just sort of taking care of kids all the time or sort of isolated. It was just exhausting. And
So, I mean, I know this probably is not part of the main story. Why didn't you just decide to like take like get do play dates? Maybe find like mom groups, something like that, mommy and me classes, anything like that. Take them to the park, like let them go play. I mean, well, the 5-year-old. the little baby, but I gotta keep her with you all the time. Keep I didn't but yeah, keep them with you all the time, but still, like there are like groups for these things because you're not. She wouldn't have been the first person for it to happen. But I do understand, like if you don't know how to find those resources, this can be lonely. So, mm,
Now, as she watched Kevin back his car out of the driveway, she could tell today was going to be another long, exhausting, lonely day.
oh,
That night, around 9 p.m., Tabitha was fast asleep on Kevin's bed with one of their sons when she felt somebody shaking her. And when she
mm,
opened her eyes and looked up, she saw Kevin standing right over her. And he leaned down and he whispered to her that it was very late and that Tabitha should go to her bed out on the pull-out couch. And
oh,
then he picked up their sleeping son and carried him off to the boy's bedroom without waiting for a response from Tabitha. As Tabitha got out of bed, she thought about just staying put and
right,
insisting on sleeping in the master bedroom that night. But,
right.
their kids were already asleep, and she also didn't want to risk getting into a fight with Kevin, especially at this hour and waking everyone up. And so ultimately, she decided against it and just left the bedroom and headed downstairs to the den. And then when she got there, Tabitha unfolded the pull-out couch and lay down, and she tried to fall asleep, but after tossing and turning for a while, she just pulled out her phone and she pulled up the number for Keith, the guy she'd been
Oh
having an
my
affair with.
gosh.
As she did this, she reminded herself that she had promised to end things with Keith. She was also feeling sort of desperate for someone to talk to. And
I mean, but your husband is in the house with you. Why? Why? What? Like that was. It's a risky move, honestly. Like it's a risky move. Like why would you decide then? Like go talk to Keith. Like if you're having these problems and you're trying to go like do therapy or like get back together with your husband, probably what's best to just like calmly like talk to him. I mean, if he was mad, like I can understand, like, okay, well, I'm gonna bag back and just, not say anything right now. But you didn't even try to attempt, like, or I mean, he probably was going straight to bed anyway. But if you're gonna work on your marriage, you should have been deleted that number. Like you should have been deleted that number. Like you should have been told him, hey, I'm gonna work this out with my husband, and you should have tossed that number like immediately. Like there's no point.
Kevin was clearly very intentionally shutting her out, so after a moment, Tabitha hit the call button.
Mm-mm.
Later that same night, around midnight, 911 operator Jacqueline Sanabria had just started her shift at the Monroe County Sheriff's Office when a call came in. Jacqueline answered it, and immediately this man's voice came over the line saying his wife had just been shot. And so right away, Jacqueline followed protocol, and as calm as she could, she asked the man, had he attempted CPR? And the man, in this eerily calm voice, said, no, he hadn't. And the reason he gave was there was simply too much blood. At 1:45 a.m. on July 14th, 2003, so about 2 hours after that 911 call, Sergeant Paul Sienna of the Monroe County Sheriff's Department pulled up in front of a large white house with black shutters and an attached garage. There were a bunch of police cruisers and forensics vans that were already on the scene, and Sienna could see neighbors who were kind of coming outside, watching from their lawns and driveways, trying to figure out what was going on. Sienna had been very surprised when he had gotten the call from dispatch about a murder in Penfield, because Penfield was a really nice, safe area. In fact,
Mm.
there had not been a single murder there in more than 40 years. Now he climbed out of his car and walked over to the front lawn where three deputies were interviewing this middle aged man who looked like he might have just gotten out of bed. One of the deputies saw Sergeant Sienna, and so he ran over to him and began to brief him on what they knew. He explained to Sienna that the man they were speaking to was Kevin Bryant. He was the man who had called 911, and he was the husband of the victim, Tabitha Bryant. The deputy said that Tabitha and Kevin's two young sons had been inside the house at the time of the shooting, but their grandparents had picked them up a few minutes ago. The house itself had already been searched, and there were no signs of forced entry, but it was not hard to guess how the killer or killers got inside. The garage door had been left open,
Oh
and
my
then the
God.
door between the inside of the garage and the inside of the house had been left unlocked. So basically, anybody off the street could have just waltzed into the house. Now, Sienna knew that in nice, safe neighborhoods like Penfield, it was not unusual for people to leave their doors and garage doors unlocked or even open.
Oh,
But at the same time, he did think it was a little unusual that it just so happened that on the night of the shooting, you know, the house was unsecured. So he wasn't really sure what to make of that. At this point, Sienna glanced over at the husband, Kevin, and he saw Kevin suddenly bend over and start dry heaving. Now, Sienna definitely wanted to talk to Kevin, but really he needed to check out the crime scene first. And also considering how, Kevin did not appear to be ready to talk right now, he figured he should just go inside and have a look around. So he ducked under the police tape that was roping off the garage, and he made his way inside. Once inside the house, Sienna passed the kitchen and also a playroom, and they looked relatively normal. And then he got to the den, and there was nothing normal about the den. There was blood everywhere on the walls, the floor, the ceiling, and there were all these forensic technicians that were inside of the den, furiously swabbing all over the room, trying to take samples of all this blood and also trying to photograph the entire scene. And in the middle of all this chaos happening in the den, Sienna saw the victim, Tabitha Bryant. She was laying on
mhm.
the pull-out couch bed. As Sienna walked over to the body to get a closer look, right away he saw this was not just a shooting because Tabitha had, more than a dozen stab wounds to her chest and her neck.
Oh,
And then also right below her right eye, there was this small, clean hole that Sienna recognized as a gunshot wound. This was an excessive amount of violence, and it made Sienna think that this could have been a crime of passion. And the
yes.
fact that Tabitha clearly had been sleeping on the pull-out couch in the den instead of in bed with her husband made Tabitha's husband, Kevin, Sienna's prime suspect.
I mean, honestly, that would be my first thought, like from the scene of the crime. Like, I'm gonna just give my what I think happened. I know, because that's the point. Like, it's just my thought. And it's so simple that because he said it's such a twist at the end, it's most likely not what happened. But I think her husband, Kevin, did not go to bed that night. Like he didn't go immediately to bed like we think or like Tabitha probably thought. And when she got on that phone and called, I don't know what happened during that phone call. Did it actually went through? Did she talk to him a minute? He probably snuck down, I believe downstairs because I'm guessing like, their bedroom was probably upstairs. He probably snuck downstairs, heard her having her little conversation. That's probably why he's already been pissed because he's thinking that it's still going on. And as soon as that phone call ended, or as soon as he realized she was talking to Keith, crime of passion, he went off. He went off. I mean, but it would be weird for him all of a sudden just like, oh, I got a knife. And then they see, oh, I got a gun. I don't know how that part plays in, but yeah, he went off. He was already icing her out because to me that says that he's still angry. He still loves her, but he's still angry. Like, and he just probably just like went at it. But that's just my guess. Let's just continue on.
I saw something on CNBC about hiring that
Okay, we're gonna skip this. You know I am. So let's do that. Uh,
your match on ZipRecruiter.
okay, cool.
At 8:40 a.m. on July 14th, 2003, so about 9 hours after Tabitha Bryant was killed, Sergeant Paul Sienna sat across from her husband, Kevin, at a diner in Rochester, New York. Now, normally, Sienna would conduct interviews like this at the sheriff's office, but he was starving after spending all night on his feet at the crime scene, and he also hoped that, this informal setting would hopefully get Kevin to be a bit more talkative. So, Sienna was suspicious of Kevin, one, because he was the husband of the victim, and right away, in murder cases, spouses are regarded as early suspects. And then also just this unusually violent murder. I mean, the murder itself was rare in a town like this, but it was just so violent, so much gore and blood. It just sort of screamed, this is a personal attack. This is a crime of passion. Again, making Kevin seem sort of suspicious here. However, the physical evidence made it look like Kevin actually could not have done it. He didn't have any blood or defensive injuries on him, which would make sense if he was the killer. I mean, given how much blood was at the scene, there should be some on him. And Sienna had checked the sinks and showers at the house to see if maybe Kevin had gotten blood on himself but cleaned himself up before police arrived. But there was no sign that there had been blood in the drains. Plus, the police had spent all night searching the house for murder weapons, a gun and maybe a knife, and so far they hadn't found anything. Still, though, Sienna was not ready to, outright dismiss Kevin as a suspect, and he was looking for any holes in Kevin's story at this point. As Kevin had already explained multiple times by this point, he said he had come home from work around 9 p.m. the night before. He said he took the trash out, and then he went right up to his bedroom to read, while Tabitha was asleep on the pull-out couch downstairs. But at around 11:30 p.m., Kevin said he had gotten a very strange phone call. He had answered, and it was a woman, and she had said hello, but then it was silent, and there was just static on the line. Kevin
Hmm.
eventually had just hung up and said he thought it was just a wrong number. But then he said a little while later, just before midnight, he'd heard gunshots and screams. Kevin said at that point he got up and he ran to his kids' bedrooms first to make sure they were safe. And when he saw they were, then he went downstairs and he found Tabitha dead in the den. And so now Sienna, sitting across from Kevin in their booth, he asked him, do you have any idea who could have done this? And Kevin, he paused for a moment, and then when he spoke, his voice cracked, and he actually began to cry as he sort of choked out that his wife's death was his fault. Now, at first, Sienna thought, oh my goodness, is this guy about to confess? Did he kill her? Is he going to tell me that? But when he
Hmm.
pressed Kevin to continue, like, what do you mean by that? Kevin very tearfully would say that, he thought he maybe was the one who had left the garage open when he had taken
Oh,
out the trash, and he
that's what he did.
suspected that that must have been how the killer or killers got inside. And then, sort of oddly, Kevin continued and basically began to lay out this whole theory for what might have happened that night, sort of unprompted. He's giving his opinion. Kevin said, as he saw it, a burglar must have driven by, saw their garage was open, and decided to rob the house. However, he said when they went inside the house to rob it, they must have been caught off guard when they saw Tabitha in the den. And she must have woken up, and there must have been some sort of confrontation, and the burglar or burglars must have panicked and killed her and then fled without even robbing the place. Like, that's probably what happened. And Sergeant Sienna did not give
Mm.
off how he felt about, what Kevin was doing and what he was saying. He just sort of nodded thoughtfully, like he was considering his theory. However, in reality, Sienna had already considered the possibility of this being a burglary gone wrong, but the way Tabitha had actually been killed just felt way too personal to chalk it up to a random intruder.
Nah.
And also, again, nothing from the house had been stolen. So what Sienna really wanted to know from Kevin was, why was Tabitha sleeping on the couch and not up with you? And to Sienna's surprise, Kevin was actually really open about these problems in their marriage. He explained that Tabitha was young, 20 years younger than he was, and she wanted to go to clubs and see friends every night of the week, while he was, usually too busy and too tired for doing that kind of stuff, so she would do it alone. Kevin said that once he'd realized his marriage was actually in trouble because of this dynamic, he said he'd put a lot of effort in to try to fix it by taking Tabitha out more often.
Yeah.
And he'd thought things were basically back on track until a few months ago when he'd found out that she was actually having an affair. He said he'd drawn
Oh.
up divorce papers and been on the verge of filing them, but Tabitha had ultimately promised that she would break off the affair, so he had decided to give her one more chance. As Kevin said this, Sienna watched him very closely, trying to gauge whether or not Kevin was lying. Kevin definitely seemed nervous as he was speaking, and he also kept tapping his foot and running his fingers through his hair. But there was a chance that was also just exhaustion and maybe some shock, lingering shock. Sienna checked his watch and saw it was almost 9 o'clock. and he knew Kevin by this point had been awake for about 24 hours. But Sienna didn't want to just let him off the hook right now, because if Kevin was guilty, if he really did kill his wife, or had something to do with it, Sienna knew he might never get a better shot at a confession than right now. So he decided he would just push Kevin to his breaking point and see if he'd crack.
Oh,
8 hours later, around 4 p.m., Sienna stared at Kevin from across an interview room at the Monroe County Sheriff's Office in downtown Rochester. Kevin was sort of slumped in his chair with his head buried in his hands, and he kept complaining about migraines. Now, Sienna was not surprised that Kevin might be feeling worn out right about now, because he'd been answering questions for the last 17 hours. And they'd
wow.
covered everything from the details of Kevin and Tabitha's relationship to their extended families, including the fact that Tabitha's half brother, Cyril, had lived with them for a few months earlier in the year and it had sort of ended
That's a
badly.
better picture of
And
him.
by this point, Kevin had made it clear that he actually thought Keith Cromwell, the guy Tabitha had been cheating on him with, should be a suspect. And Sienna had to agree. However, what Sienna couldn't get over right now was just how angry Kevin sounded when
Okay, so now that they bring the what was he, half brother back into the picture, being that he was on drugs and stuff. I don't know if he was still on drugs at the time, but being that he was on drugs and stuff, he could still be possibly a suspect. Think about it, like she has this big, nice house. He probably thinks that they got some money, and he's on drugs. He needs, you know, whatever valuables they have in the house. He could possibly decide, like, hey, I want to steal 'em. And even though, like, she was like stabbed so many times, I hate to say that, but she was attacked the way she was attacked. Like, he could have been in a drug-induced situation and it just like went crazy, or he could be like in a fit of rage or jealousy. Drugs, it went crazy. But yeah, yeah, let's keep going.
ever he mentioned Keith, I mean, he was truly enraged. He
I
clearly
understand
was
that
not
reaction.
remotely over his wife's affair. And so now Sienna was trying to gauge if maybe Kevin was angry enough about this to have committed murder. And so Sienna decided he would push Kevin a little bit further and extend the interview, and he did this by suggesting that they go ahead and order dinner. And at that point, Kevin, who was totally mad, he jumped up out of his chair and he said that unless he was under arrest, he needed to go back to his kids. And
Right.
Sienna did not have the evidence to hold Kevin, so he had no choice but to tell him that, of course, he was free to leave. And as Sienna watched a deputy escort Kevin out of the room, he felt a little disappointed that he had not managed to get a confession. But he had gotten some pretty promising leads. Primarily, there was Tabitha's half brother, Cyril, who
Hmm.
definitely sounded like he knew a lot about Kevin and Tabitha's relationship, and he could have some good insights. And also, Sienna was thinking as soon as possible, he needed to speak to Keith, who was Tabitha's affair partner. At 10 a.m. the next morning, Sergeant Sienna sat across from a broad shouldered, bald, middle aged man in the living room of a small house outside of Rochester. This was Keith Cromwell, the man that Tabitha had been having.
I'm sorry that Petty and me has to come out. It's it's the one you chose to do that with. He must got
An affair with, and he struck Sienna as being a pretty tough, intense guy. So Sienna was actually a bit taken aback when he asked Keith about his affair with Tabitha, and Keith just began to cry. Just
oh,
seems sort of uncharacteristic for the way he appeared, at least at first glance. But Keith quickly wiped his eyes and he apologized, and then he asked what exactly Sienna wanted to know. And Sienna told him to just, start at the beginning. So Keith explained that he was a machine operator at a local factory, and it was a really stressful job. So Keith would sometimes blow off steam by going to a nearby strip club. And it
oh,
was at that strip club about 6 months earlier that he had met Tabitha Bryant. And this really caught Sienna off guard. And he immediately asked Keith, like, what was Tabitha doing there at the strip club? But Keith just shrugged and said Tabitha had a wild side. She was a regular there.
Mm.
Sienna was still sort of taken aback by this and really didn't know what to think of it, but he just told Keith to keep telling his story. And so Keith continued and he explained how he and Tabitha had exchanged numbers that first night and then started texting and calling, and how that eventually turned into regular meetups when Kevin was at work. He said by July, they were hanging out several times a week and speaking on the phone basically every day. And
Mm.
Keith said this continued right up until Tabitha's death. And here, Sienna had to stop Keith again, because Kevin had told Sienna that Tabitha and Keith, their affair, was over. But here Keith was basically telling Sienna the opposite. And so when Sienna pressed him on it, Keith said that actually Tabitha had called him around 11 p.m. on Sunday night, only about an hour before she was killed. And so this timing just felt like way too big of a coincidence, and it made Sienna wonder if Keith was actually just trying to give himself an alibi. Except it was not a very good one, because Keith lived close enough to Tabitha and Kevin that after that last phone call at about 11 o'clock, he would have had time to hang up the phone and drive over to their house and commit the murder by midnight. So this
Mm.
really wasn't an alibi. So now Sienna realized he was in a tough spot here. Tabitha's affair really gave both Kevin and Keith strong motives to want to kill her. And so basically, neither man could be ruled out. They were kind of like equally primary suspects at this point. And on top of that, the additional information that Tabitha had been a regular at a strip club just raised a lot of additional questions. He realized he really needed to speak to someone who really knew Tabitha.
Mm.
5 days later, on July 19th, 2003, Sergeant Sienna stood inside of a cemetery at the back of a group of mourners and watched as Tabitha Bryant's casket was lowered into the ground. Sienna had come to Tabitha's funeral not only to pay his respects, but also because he was looking for her half brother, Cyril, and he had two
Oh,
reasons he
half
really
brother.
wanted to speak to him. First of
Yeah,
all, he
I think I
thought
said that.
Cyril might have some additional unique insights into Tabitha's various relationships. I mean, Cyril had lived with Tabitha and Kevin and their kids earlier that year, and Sienna had heard that Cyril and Tabitha were quite close, and so maybe she had shared some additional insights that he would know. But the second reason for wanting to speak to Cyril was recently, Sienna had also begun to look at Cyril as being maybe a potential suspect. So
Mm.
Sienna had spoken with a number of Tabitha's friends, and from those interviews, Sienna had learned that Cyril and his girlfriend Cassidy were also both regulars at that same strip club that Tabitha went to. And then on
Really?
top of that, Sienna knew that, Cyril and Cassidy had been caught using drugs by Tabitha and Kevin, and that's why they had been booted from the house just a few months ago. And so who knows, there could be some bad blood there. And so this made Sienna wonder if Tabitha's murder might have had nothing to do with her affair and everything to do with, very likely some fight that she had had with Cyril and Cassidy when she caught them and kicked them out. But now, as Sienna scanned the funeral crowd, he didn't see anybody who matched Cyril's description. And so when the service ended and all the mourners began making their way out to the parking lot, Sienna hustled over to Tabitha's mother and he asked her, had Cyril attended the funeral? And she said that actually no one had heard from Cyril since the night Tabitha was killed. And she said that she was really worried about him because Cyril's mental health was quite fragile. About a year
Mm.
earlier, he'd suffered a huge mental breakdown after the death of another sibling, which was why Tabitha had invited him to live with her in the first place. And so
Oh.
now Tabitha's mom was afraid that Cyril had spiraled again and might be in trouble. But as empathetic as Sienna was, ultimately, this information he was getting from the mother did not paint Cyril as like a guy in need of help. It painted Cyril as being really suspicious.
Mm-hmm.
And so, as politely as he could, Sienna asked the mom if she had any idea of like how he could go about trying to find Cyril, like any way he could even begin that process. And Tabitha's mom, she thought for a moment and then said that if anyone knew where Cyril was, it was his girlfriend, Cassidy Green. One night,
Mm. Mm, 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 mm.
About a week after Tabitha's funeral, Sergeant Sienna sat in the back of an unmarked van in downtown Rochester. And through the windshield, he watched a man standing alone in an alley, pacing back and forth, constantly checking his phone. This was all part of a sting operation that Sienna hoped would finally lead him to Tabitha's half brother Cyril. Ever since Tabitha's funeral, he and his fellow deputies have been trying to track Cyril down, but so far they'd had no luck. It looked an awful lot like Cyril had either left town or was actively hiding from the police.
Mm.
However, Sienna had managed to locate Cyril's girlfriend, Cassidy, who, it would turn out, was well known to the police for being a drug dealer and an escort who went by the
Oh.
working name of Angel. Now, Sienna doubted that if he approached Cassidy directly, that she would just immediately give up Cyril's location willingly, and so what he needed to do was like get leverage on her first. So Sienna went to an informant of his with a plan. The informant would reach out to Cassidy or Angel looking to buy some cocaine, and then once they had clear evidence that she had broken the law by selling these drugs, Sienna would arrest her and then try to strike a deal to get her to talk about Cyril. And so now, through a pair of binoculars, Sergeant Sienna watched as a small blonde woman appeared at the far end of the alley. His heartbeat picked up as he realized it was definitely Cassidy, and he watched as she walked right up the alley and began talking to the informant, the man who had been pacing before on his phone. And when Sienna saw the money and drugs change hands, he gave the command on his radio to go ahead and move in. In an instant, two police cars rounded the corner with their sirens blaring, cutting off both ends of the alley. Cassidy looked completely startled and started to run before the arriving deputies boxed her in, and moments later, they had her in handcuffs.
Hmm.
The following morning, Sienna stood outside of an interview room at the sheriff's office in Rochester, New York. He looked through a two-way mirror, and on the other side of the glass, he watched a deputy question Cassidy, the girlfriend of Tabitha's half-brother Cyril, who was still missing and still a major suspect. Now, Cassidy had been completely stonewalling police since they'd arrested her for selling cocaine the night before, and she was still insisting that she had no idea where Cyril was or why he'd disappeared. Now, to this point, the deputy who was speaking to Cassidy had not brought up Tabitha's murder. And so at this point, Cassidy seemed to think that her only problem was the cocaine charge. And so as Sienna watched this interview just kind of go in circles and drag because Cassidy just was not giving them anything, finally Sienna just couldn't take it anymore, and he just busted in the room and he slammed a folder down right on the table, totally shocking not just the deputy, but Cassidy. They both looked at him
Dang.
like, "What are you doing?" And then before Cassidy could say or do anything, Sienna looked right at her and just said, "I don't care about your drug charge. What I want to know is what you know about Tabitha Bryant's murder." And at first, Cassidy just
I'm sorry because I have such an active imagination. I just imagine somebody just busting in like the Kool-Aid man, like, oh yeah. And just like, wait, is that the Kool-Aid man? Anyway, it's just like throwing down the file, like, I don't care about the drugs. What you know about Tabitha's death? Like, where's your boyfriend? It's like, what? Huh? I thought this was about like what I did on the corner. What, huh? Like, just everybody just sitting there confused. Like, why? Anyway, it looks like it's close to the end. Wait, how many lives? Yeah, we're getting close to the end, so we're gonna get like to the point of this. I hope it's like just so far fetched.
stared back at Sienna and said nothing. And for a minute, Sienna thought maybe he had sort of miscalculated here. But then, after
Mm-hmm.
a long, awkward pause, Cassidy's whole demeanor shifted and she started to talk.
Oh, dang. So she did know.
Based on witness testimony, evidence collected at the crime scene, and the killer's eventual confession, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Tabitha Bryant on the night of July 13th, 2003.
Okay, what's up?
Around 11:50 p.m., the killer very carefully crept through the first floor of the Bryant home carrying a rifle. And they went straight to the den, where they found Tabitha asleep on the pull-out couch. For a moment, the killer paused, just staring down at Tabitha, wondering, questioning whether they could really go through with this. But
Mm.
then, after just a little bit of deliberation in their own minds, raised the rifle, and they fired. The bullet entered Tabitha's skull right under her right eye, but it
Oof.
didn't kill her. And so, as the killer is standing there watching, expecting Tabitha to basically be motionless, Tabitha wasn't. Her body began jerking around, and then she suddenly reached up and grabbed at her cheek, and she sat up and she looked at the killer and began to scream. And so the killer immediately fired two more times, but Tabitha was moving around so much in her own panic that
Okay.
both shots missed. And then on the fourth shot, when the killer pulled the trigger for the fourth time, the rifle jammed. And so at this point, the killer completely panicked. And so the killer turns and they run into the kitchen. All the while, Tabitha is flailing around in the den. She's
Noticed that the killer knew
screaming,
where the
blood's
kitchen
going
was.
everywhere. And the killer, they grab a butcher's knife from the kitchen. They run back into the den. And when they get there, they see Tabitha is now standing and she's
Mm.
clutching at her face. She's screaming. And the killer tackles her back onto the bed and begins stabbing her over and over again in the neck and the chest until
Hey,
she
this
does
has been a
finally
long
go limp.
time.
When the killer climbed off of Tabitha and stood back up, they realized they, like the rest of the room, were covered in blood. And so the killer began just sort of backing away from the scene, not really sure what they were going to do. And as they're doing this, they hear a noise behind them and they whip around and they see there was a figure coming down the stairs. And when this figure got to the bottom of the stairs, they walked right up to the killer and handed them an envelope. And the killer took the envelope, blood all over them. They take the envelope, they open it up, they look inside to confirm that yes, it was stuffed with $100 bills. It would turn out the person who actually wielded the rifle and the knife and literally killed Tabitha was her half brother Cyril.
Mm.
He got covered in blood so that the real mastermind, Tabitha's husband, Kevin,
Okay, so I was going in the right direction with the half brother, but the motive was hold up. You know what? Let's keep going because the motive might still be there. It's just not the way I thought it would be. Let's see.
could keep his hands clean. Kevin paid Cyril and his girlfriend Cassidy $5,000 to do his dirty work for him. Cyril committed the murder, and Cassidy drove the getaway car. But long before they got to the house that night, Kevin was setting things up so that the murder would go according to his plan. Kevin
Um,
opened the garage and unlocked the door to the house so that Cyril could come inside no problem. And when he found Tabitha in their bed upstairs, he woke her up and told her to head on down to the den, where he knew
yeah.
Cyril would look for her. Kevin was motivated by anger over Tabitha's affair with Keith, and also the fear that he would lose his kids if they got divorced.
Mm.
But ironically, it was actually Kevin's own actions that drove Tabitha, literally, into Keith's arms. Kevin portrayed himself as this, hardworking lawyer who basically was a workaholic and all he did was provide for his family. But in reality, he was a drug and sex addict who routinely brought sex workers to his law office. His
Oh,
idea of working on his marriage, as he said he and Tabitha were doing after he discovered her affair, really just involved taking Tabitha to strip clubs and then pressuring her into having group sex with other sex workers. And then he would also pressure her to give lap dances to the other clientele.
my
One of
pearls.
those other clientele was Keith. That's how they met. Kevin and Cyril were both convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. As for Cassidy, she ultimately took a plea deal and received 15 years.
Wait, what? You know what?
Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Today's story is about.
No, what? So I'm really mad because I was kind of mad at her for doing what she did, but now that I know the whole story, it's like, dude was a jerk. And like, what the heck? Okay, I'm just at a loss because like it was just like I don't even know what to say, honestly, because that was sad. It was horrible. Like, it made me think, oh, she cheated and that's wrong, and like she was just lonely and she just needed some like other mom friends to help her. No, no. Lawyer dude was just a jerk. And it's so sad. Like there was no like I don't even know what to say. For some reason it just makes me feel just like this is terrible. But anyway, I'm gonna leave it there, people. Let me put this back on screen. Okay, I'm gonna just leave it there, people. That was the video for today. If you have your own comments, your own like what you want to respond about it, please leave it in the comment section. I want to get your ideas on this. But yeah, I'm a little disappointed with that one. I mean, it was a great video, yes, but hey, like that was her whole family. But anyway, bye bye.